suggests that the main reason we have vampire myths is they didn't have Grissom from CSI back then to explain to people how corpses actually decayed. But the one thing in doing research on like why people were digging up dead relatives and staking them and everything, I mean, staking was to transfix them, was to literally keep them from getting up out of the earth and walk, whether in flesh or in spirit. But there's a missing piece that is not often covered in a lot of the folklore. We're talking Eastern European countries. We understand one of the connections with life and feeding on life force has a lot to do with, you know, the book of Leviticus, the blood is the life, the spirit of a being exists in its blood. It's one of the reasons that the kosher laws exist as they do. So we know some of the vampire fascination in these countries has to do with Christianity. What I learned through Dom Augustin Calmet, he's got a book that is often translated as The Phantom World, and he was writing at the time of the vampire craze. If you're familiar with vampire folklore and you've heard of the case of like Arnold Powell, the itinerant farmer who like fell off of a hay cart and died and came back, and all the really classic vampires from folklore, Dom Augustin Calmet, who was a monk, is the one who collected those stories. And in his collection of these tales, one of the things he cites is in the Catholic Church, in the traditional Western Church, if your body didn't decay, that was a sign that you were pure, that was a sign that you were a saint. And so there are many, many cases of saints' bodies that do not decay or were seen as not decaying, which made him question as to how in these countries it was seen as a sign of basically the spirit was damned. In the Eastern Orthodox Church, their rite of excommunication, when somebody really pissed them off and they needed to like say, you know, get thee gone, their rite of excommunication condemns that person's soul to be rejected by God and nature. And so the belief was if God wasn't going to take the soul, they would stay stuck in the physical body and that body would not decay. And that led to, prior to the vampire outbreaks, people, about a year after someone had been interred, they would dig them up and basically see whether or not they'd gotten their golden ticket to heaven. If they were nice and, you know, happily decayed and everything was going along, that was cool, and obviously grandma, grandpa, they made it on up. But if that body was not decayed in a way that they felt was appropriately decayed, that was a grave that needed to be handled because there was some bad stuff going on there.
Yeah, a lot of the times they would say that the dead would come back if they were buried at a crossroads. There were all sorts of methods of dispatching, you know, the bodies afterward. They would use iron or wood that was supposedly used in, you know, Christ's cross. I think there were 3 or 4 different types of wood that they would specifically go after and say that it was more holy. You know, the ruler would only be killed by an iron needle. Iron was used a lot with almost anything that was considered supernatural as a way of pinning them down because it you know, burned them.
In Asian mythology, there's this hopping vampire. And it made me crazy trying to figure out, like, it seems silly. Like, okay, so your vampire, your scary, scary vampire comes and he hops after his victims. And I finally managed to corner a friend who was a first-generation Chinese-American. I'm like, hopping vampires, seriously, what is the deal? How did that even come up? And it's the same concept. In the West, to transfix a corpse and keep it from walking, you know, we'd drive a stake in it, we'd nail it down, we'd wrap it in a fishing net, anything that would keep them in. In some cases, they would take spindles and drive the spindles into the ground above the grave. Over in Asia, they would tie the big toes together. And that would slow him down and hobble him if he decided to get up and go walking after people, so any risen corpse would then be compelled to go hopping after their prey. Obviously, they couldn't untie knots.
That would have made a very funny parody for vampires or a zombie film.
Yeah. There are a couple of Asian things where, like, you've got like this crazy, like, they're gray and they've got weird hair and they're bouncing around after people, so hopping vampires. Yeah. Now, for the paranormal, there's some interesting instances and crossover between the idea of the vampire, the fetch, and various types of spirits and hauntings. As the vampires come down to us, especially through the lens of fiction and folklore, I mean, we know what a vampire is. It's a risen corpse, he gets up, usually has fangs, drinks physical blood, undead, sunlight burns into a cinder, yada, yada, yada. And Buffy, whether it's a toothpick or a popsicle stick, can just stake them like nobody's business. But if you go back to the folklore, they did not always drink blood. Blood was often made as an assumption when they dug the corpses up, there would be fluid in the coffin that was, whether they knew it or not, a side effect of actual decay. And it would be pinkish or reddish with bodily fluids. But they felt that that was a sheer sign that this thing had been sucking blood and just was literally wallowing in it, in its coffin. But many of
also lead into the shroud eaters.
Naxara, yeah, the shroud eaters, where they would be seen to eat their fingers or eat their lips, and they were so hungry and starving in the grave that they would gnaw on that and gnaw on their shroud. There's about as many names for vampires throughout the folklore as there are different ways in which they would prey on people.
Not exactly what you'd want to seduce you in modern cinema.
Well, most of them were fat, like red face. Red as a vampire is one of the descriptions. And many of them were, at least in the folklore, peasants. They weren't suave, well-dressed counts or lords. That's something that got moved into the fiction as they turned the folkloric boogeyman into a monster that we could tell stories about, that in a lot of ways is a mirror that we hold up to ourselves and to our society. The paranormal aspect of it is, as you go through the folklore, you find some of these reports where they don't literally believe that it's a physical body appearing to them. It's more the image of the person that is able to slip into the room through any closed door, through any locked window, that hovers over the victim in the bed. And it sounds more like an astral attack, or what we might recognize as a hag attack, a mara, where you would see the spirit hanging over someone, pressing them into the bed. Stealing of the breath is another thing that crosses over between these myths.
I also read about Thomas Aquinas, the Roman Catholic Church. He was actually one of the first people that I was able to find would speculate that, like the devil, vampires were able to metamorph into animals, creatures, fog and mist. And maybe you could, add to this, but I think that is where Stoker actually got his idea, where we all have firmly in our minds now, oh, vampire can be, all these different things other than just a human.
There's a lot of crossover. Harry Sen, and it's a very hard to get a hold of little book called The Werewolf and Vampire in Romania. It's basically his master's or PhD treatise. And he went, and it was in the 70s, and was still interviewing like the living vampire myths. And there is an incredible amount of crossover between what we would identify as vampires and werewolves, vampires and incubi or succubi, vampires and night hag attacks, even vampires and fairies. Like the lines in the folklore are incredibly blurry. Anybody who's gone on ghost hunts, I mean, it would be great if we had neat little boxes to put things into that we encounter. But out in the field, you encounter something that has certain qualities, but we don't have a Tobin's spirit guide to go, if it does this and does this and does this, it is automatically that.
Yeah, the Romanians actually called everything the Strigoi. Whether it was a witch, werewolf, or vampire, they just said, oh, this is what it is, because in their minds it was all the same type of creature. Someone could change into any of these aspects.
Well, in Harry Sen's writing, one of the beliefs that he found was if you were a werewolf in life and you died, you came back as a vampire. Of course, if your parents conceived you on Christmas, you'd come back as a vampire. If you were born with a little tail, if you had twinned pupils, if you had a hair lip, if you had too much hair, and pretty much if your parents were getting it on during any high holy day, you were pretty much going to come back as a vampire. Or if you're suicide, you'd come back as a vampire. And if you had gotten cast out of your church, you would also come back as a vampire. Pretty much like you would have expected Europe to be full of vampires.
Yeah, it's really incredible when you really dig deep into the past history of people's paranoia and superstition. It's like Michelle said earlier, any of the folklore creatures, I would go so far as to say that dating back to Gilgamesh, vampires and zombies were mentioned in those works. And ever since then, it's been a vehicle for social commentary all the way up to Mr. Romero, talking about it's a metaphor of where society is at. Every era, every generation has its own version or interpretation of any of these type creatures. It's how we express ourselves through fiction and through horror in general.
So, who's your favorite as it goes out of all of the obscure folklore, as it moves into fiction, as it moves into film? Who's your favorite? Anybody have a favorite night-stalking vampire?
Marius.
Marius, all right, so that's Anne Rice's world.
Graf Orlok.
Say it again?
Graf Orlok.
Oh, Orlok. All right. Anyone? I have a personal favorite, and you may or may not be familiar with the writer. She was writing at the same time Anne Rice, Le Comte de Saint-Germain by Chelsea Quinn Yarbrough, who I grew up reading Quinn's stuff, and like, 15-year-old me wanted to grow up to be Quinn. Like, she is amazing, and her Saint-Germain very much informed like my idea of like the perfect fictional vampire.
I'd have to say that I was originally enthralled by Gary Oldman when he did Dracula, just because of how he presented himself. I know a lot of critics really hated Stoker's work, but I think Oldman really captured, the true classic Dracula. Of course, it's totally different than the visual effects of Hollywood's black and white era. You can point to any version of these characters and say, for the audience that were watching it, they were enthralled by that particular persona. And I honestly think it's the projection and the power of these actors and whoever wrote the script. They were saying, this is seduction. For every era, women were fainting when these certain actors would come on a Broadway stage or on the silver screen. The same heartthrobs in the 90s when Interview with the Vampire came out, and it's, oh my God, Brad Pitt. We always have this happening.
So how does the folkloric creature go to what we are much more familiar with on the screen? A lot of that actually has to do with the way you have to write about stories. So the vampire transitions from folklore to fiction around about the late 1700s. I believe the first place where it appears in print in a fictional work is by Heinrich Ossenfelder, Der Vampir, and it's a long poem. A more familiar, if you're an English major, Christabel, by the same Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who also gave you the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. And in Christabel, there's a vampiric creature, Geraldine. And there's curious tension that there may be some transgressive sexuality going on in Christabel, and Coleridge was an odd enough duck that might have been intentional on his part.
I have the poem right in front of me, and skimming through it while she's talking, there's a lot of sexuality, and it's not very hidden.
Coleridge notably had some influence on a young gal, Mary Shelley. At the time, she was Mary Wollstonecraft. Mary ended up, off of Lake Geneva in Switzerland, 200 years ago next year, actually, the Haunted Summer. It was Mary Shelley, her not-quite husband that she'd gone off with, Percy Shelley, Mary's half-sister, Claire Claremont, a fellow named Lord Byron's physician, Polidori. And it was known as the Year Without a Summer because there had been, unbeknownst to most of the folks in Europe, like this massive volcanic event. So this huge ash cloud just pretty much guarantees that their summer is just wet and stormy and cold. So for lack of anything better to do, they decide that they're going to tell ghost stories. And Byron had already gone on a trip through Greece and in parts of Eastern Europe and had become fascinated with the idea of the vampire. He's got a poem called the E.R, which has the lines, "But first on earth is vampires sent. Thy corpse shall from thy tomb be rent, and ghastly haunt thy native place, and suck the blood of all thy race." So in this little competition between them, Byron writes a half-hearted thing about vampires. Polidori steals it and ends up turning it into The Vampire, spelled with a Y, that he publishes. Mary Shelley, you might know what she wrote. It's a little thing called Frankenstein. that little like summer dinner party between the whole lot of them, like you put that many creative minds together, like that has left a stamp on horror fiction and just the horror genre the whole time. I mean, Frankenstein and really the vampire as we know it comes from there. Now, most people don't know Polidori's work, and there's good reason why. It's terrible. It was published in the Dark Blue, which was a magazine in 1819. It was published anonymously with the hint that it was Byron, and eventually, like, Byron kind of lost his shit and was like, "This is totally not mine. I would never write dribble like this. just no." And Polidori really, this is where we get the vampire that we get. Polidori had the ill luck of being Italian, Roman Catholic, and gay at a time when you could still get hung for that. And he was all Twitter pated over Lord Byron, and Byron was the sort of person who would seduce rather than be seduced. So really, when Polidori was coming onto him, Byron was just kind of a dick to him. Well, not very kind at all. And that ended poorly. Polidori eventually kills himself. So the story doesn't have a good ending. But what Polly does is he lampoons Byron. His main character, his vampire. If you're reading it as an American, the vampire's name is Lord Ruthven, R-U-T-H-V-E-N. I've heard from my British friends that the right way to pronounce that is Riven. So pick whichever way you want. But Lord Ruthven is this suave, seductive. He's obviously Byron. He's got like these cold gray eyes that seem like dead inside. And he only feeds on virgins, which Byron was never that particular. But he's where we get the vampire as the courtly lord, the seductive lord, who's using his power to seduce.
Prior to Byron, the shambling Nosferatu, Count Orlok in the black and white, I think it's the first vampire movie ever done. That's where we suddenly come to a screeching halt, and when Byron's character comes along, he in turn influences Barney the Vampire from the mid-1800s, and it just seems like after the Penny Dreadful novels that keep churning out by multiple people, that we keep seeing like Carmilla's, first lesbian vampire. I believe that there were some others that were, homoerotic in poetry, because, as you pointed out earlier, the Germanic poems in the 1700s, the poems influenced fiction. Fiction, in turn, influenced plays and later early cinema.
Well, the thing about the vampire is he's a human monster. He looks like everybody else, except for when he sparkles, and don't get me started on that.
I wasn't going to bring that up.
Oh, I just... Anyway, he looks like everybody else, but he gives artists and writers an opportunity